Hello and welcome to today's virtual program, Unpacking South Korea's snap presidential election. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Tom Byrne. I'm the president and CEO of the Korea Society. I'm live from South Korea, where the winner of the presidential election was just declared in the early hours of the morning today. After months of uncertainty triggered by former President Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law declaration and the impeachment and removal from office of former President Yoon Suk-yeol, South Korea has brought this chapter to a close with the snap election of President Lee Jae-myung. One article I read here over the past several days is that economics was the big factor driving voters' choices. Inflation has come down, but prices are high. A Bank of Korea governor lowered South Korea's GDP forecast to 0.8% this year, halving it from the previous forecast. And President Lee Jae-myung, his first executive order, set up an economic emergency task force. But we are here tonight because of politics, not for economics. Yoon is the second president South Korea has removed from office by impeachment in less than a decade. No president in the U.S. has been removed from office by impeachment in the 236-year history of the United States. To help us understand the results of the election, we are joined by two experts, both of whom are veterans of Korea Society's programming. And I should say that the sun is not setting on South Korea's network today. We have Aram Hur calling in from London. Timothy Martin is up in Seoul. John and Chelsie from 350 Madison Avenue in New York City. And I am here in Busan, South Korea. Aram Hur is the Kim Koo Chair of Korean Studies and Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. Adam is also a good friend of the Korea Society, having won its Sherman Family Scholar Award. So welcome, Aram. Timothy Martin is the Korea Bureau Chief for the Wall Street Journal in Seoul, overseeing the journal's coverage of North and South Korea. Thank you for joining us again, Tim. Before we begin the conversation, the Korea Society thanks the Korea Foundation, our corporate sponsors, and individual members for their generous support, which has made this program possible. We welcome your questions live. Please send your questions throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. The moderators for today's discussions are the Korea Society's Policy Director, Jonathan Corrado, and Policy Program Officer, Chelsie Alexandre. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good morning. Good morning, Chelsie.
Morning.
Good morning, Tom. Good morning, Tim and Aram. We appreciate all of our guests for joining us today and all of our viewers online for tuning in. I want to start the conversation by taking a step back to remember how we got here, because this is not business as usual, as Tom described. Normally, it takes 2 months between the time that a Korean president is elected and the time they are inaugurated. In this case, that transpired within a single day. And of course, former President Yoon Suk-yeol was set to continue in office for another 2 years before he was impeached and removed from office. So let's look at this period now with a little bit of hindsight and retrospect and think about what are the key moments and how do you think history will remember this period? Tim, let's start with you and then go over to Aram.
There's been no shortage of plot over the last 6 months, and it's actually been roughly exactly 6 months from when this saga began. December 3rd, former President Yoon Suk-yeol declares martial law. And that's my first moment I think I'll take away from this years from now. It's that scene on the National Assembly grounds. Troops, citizens, lawmakers, all squaring off. Lawmakers trying to get inside the building to hold a vote to force President Yoon to lift martial law. And I just remember that video scene, that clip. She wasn't a lawmaker, but someone affiliated with the party saying, have you no shame? 부끄럽지 않아. And, that started really this almost cinematic period we saw in South Korean politics. And the next thing that comes to mind is, we advanced forward. Yoon was impeached eventually. And we see the showdown at presidential compound, because at this point, the criminal trial had begun and prosecutors wanted to arrest him. And for the first attempt, there was, we had a showdown between Yoon's Secret Service and prosecutors, and they weren't able to get in. It was a huge buildup. It was tense. We wondered if there might be violence. I'll certainly remember that in the years ahead. And, we eventually saw President Yoon. He was ousted at the Constitutional Court. They kicked off a 60-day snap election, which ended yesterday, if I'm remembering the time here. Anyways, the results came in earlier our day here in Seoul. But on the campaign trail, remember this scene of Lee Jae-myung, now President Lee Jae-myung, giving speeches with a bulletproof vest behind bulletproof glass, a scene that might not be wholly unusual in the US, completely foreign in Korea.
Really fascinating. Thank you very much, Tim. Aram, over to you for any additional thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think this saga has become for many Koreans kind of the 9/11 of America. Where were you and what were you doing when the Twin Towers were hit? And ironically, the day before the martial law decree, which was the morning time in the U.S., I had just been at a panel at Harvard discussing threats to democratic quality in South Korea.
Wow.
And one of the participants was grilling me on, do you really think that this affects the quality of democracy in one of the gold standard democracies in Asia?
Wow.
And then, of course, I then emailed the next morning, here's your live proof. So it's a moment that I'll never forget.
Yeah.
I think one moment that Tim did not bring up that was, I think, pivotal for me was actually the unanimous constitutional ruling of impeachment. And I think the actual decision text is worth reading in full because I think it captures the court's understanding of democracy in that moment, where the processual element was really sort of a key component in justifying the impeachment. I think, years from now, when we look back at this whole saga and how it ultimately ended, with a successful snap election, I think history will see it as sort of a bittersweet victory and triumph for South Korea's democracy. Sweet because ultimately, for now, institutions did prevail. I mean, things could have gone, I think, just much worse than how they have ended. And the legitimacy of the democratic repertoire so far has prevailed. But I think it's also bitter because, the long-standing weaknesses and divisions in Korean society have really now come to the surface in a way where they're just now out in the open. And I think this is going to continue to pose real threats to the substance of democracy in South Korea.
And you're almost a victim of your own success because your scholarly theories, which have been pointing out some of these areas of concern in terms of South Korea's democracy, have now been exposed to be, you've been vindicated in a sense, right? That this was an area of concern. But of course, that's not really a sweet success because this is a distressing period. And there's this, I think you've highlighted, both of you in your remarks, this interesting tension between every single moment along this stage was filled with so much drama and tension, and yet there was not political violence to the extent that many were concerned about. So South Korea's institutions did hold and did filter through the process. And we could discuss a little bit later whether we think this episode represents the resilience of Korea's democracy or some inherent weaknesses in Korea's democracy. And Aram, I'll turn to you in just a minute to discuss that. So we're going to get to the candidates, and that we're going to talk about the losing candidate. We're going to talk about the winning candidate. But the first thing I want to talk about are the domestic implications of Lee Jae-myung's electoral victory here. So what does this mean for South Korean society? So Aram, we'll start with you on the democracy portion. You started to address this a little bit, but any follow-up thoughts for what this really means for South Korea's democracy?
Well, Lee Jae-myung's victory now gives him control of both the presidency and the National Assembly. And even in a healthy democracy with no salient divisions, that's already a pretty tempting recipe for executive overreach. And so in a democracy with deep identity divisions where the winning candidate received almost a majority vote on the heels of what the public largely agrees as a moral blunder by the opposition, this is a risky situation for democratic rule. And it demands the highest level of forbearance by the winning party and mutual tolerance of the former opponent PPP. And it remains to be seen, I think, whether Lee Jae-myung as a leader possesses those traits, but also if he can reel in his party, right? The victorious party to follow the rules of the game as he promised on the campaign trail. And I think that, following the very familiar path of now potentially forcibly, there's calls for forcibly dissolving the PPP, or the need to stack the courts for constitutional reform, all in the name of ostensibly defending and restoring democracy. I think falling into that trap is only going to further deepen the identity divide between the left and right in South Korean society that contributed to the martial law crisis in the very first place.
Really well put. Thank you so much, Aram. And Tim, over to you to talk about polarization, economics, culture. And I'll note that one of our Korea Society members, Michael Ralston, is particularly interested in the matter of political polarization. And this is one thing that we saw President Lee bring up in his inauguration speech. So what do you think about prospects for actually achieving that?
Indeed, President Lee did speak about wanting to unify the country, and he'll support and fight for the South Koreans who did not vote for him. But piggyback on Professor Hu's point, I think I'm brought back to that phrase from the Spider-Man films: with great power comes great responsibility. Because while, yes, there's extremely high levels of political division in South Korea, there's a Pew poll from not too long ago. It looked at democracies and who has the most divided or biggest sense of polarization within their society. U.S. was number 2 at 88% or roughly there.
Wow.
The only country higher was South Korea. I think they were
Wow.
around 90%. So, I mean, we're at a point now where, people might dislike you simply because of the political candidate you don't like or you support, which was not the case in the past. But I think what changes with the Lee victory, the emotions, this discord within society, it's going to take some time for that to dissipate. And certainly Lee and his party will have a big role in that. But what's changed is the sort of political tools, the political logistics of this division. As Professor Ha has said, the Democratic Party controls. I mean, they have a strong majority in the parliament. They'll be able to pass what they want with the president who won't veto their legislative agenda. So we're going to see some action. Now, how the country responds to that, we'll have to see.
Thanks very much. Okay, so let's now turn to the losing candidate in this election. That was the PPP's Kim Moon-soo. Interesting backstory and rather unconventional path to the candidacy. Like Lee Jae-myung, he was a former factory worker and a labor activist. So that's not the typical story, right, for a conservative candidate. So Tim, over to you to learn a little bit more about Kim Moon-soo and maybe why he didn't succeed this time around.
He did not succeed in the presidential election, but I don't think he's going away within the Conservative Party. Now, his background as a student activist, labor activist, is unusual for conservative, but not unusual for a progressive in South Korea, because he was one up until a certain point. And that shifted. I mean, he was imprisoned, tortured. I mean, he was one of the out of a lack of a better term, a celebrity activist. He was one of the most prominent activists during the critical period of democratization in the late 1980s. He comes out of prison. He sees that capitalism is flourishing in South Korea. He sees the fall of the Soviet Union. This is in his biography, and he decides, maybe I'm on the wrong side. So he's been firmly on the conservatives for decades. He's had scandals. He was, he actually had one of President Lee's former jobs as governor of Gyeonggi province.
Wow.
And he had sort of gone away until somewhat recently. Former President Yoon tapped him to become labor minister. In the buildup to that, I remember the one time we quoted him before the election was he was chastising young people for wanting to have dogs rather than families and babies. And so he's in the cabinet. And he skyrockets politically as a character. and as a candidate around martial law. Everyone else in the Yoon cabinet apologized for the martial law move. He did not. And that ingratiated him with the conservative base that looked at Yoon's decision and understood the logic, at least, or understood the sense of political paralysis, crisis in the country. That took him to the nomination. And by the way, the reason why I think he's got some staying power is he was able to fend off an attempt by the senior leaders of the Conservative Party to put in former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo.
Yeah.
And that was rejected. He actually sued his party, but
Wow.
that was rejected by the broader People Power Party base. And I think if you look and thought how he might perform once the public polls stopped about a week ago, I mean, he got more than 41% of the vote. The third party candidate, also a conservative, underperformed. So this leaves us in an interesting spot as the conservatives try to figure out what's next. I think Kim Moon-soo is likely to be part of that discussion.
Really interesting. Thanks so much, Tim. Aram, over to you, and any additional thoughts on Kim Moon-soo and this question of his electability as a candidate going forward. How much was this particular election a referendum on the party rather than him as an individual? And what was the role of the third party candidate, Lee Jun-suk, that refused to cobble together a coalition? And could that have made a difference?
Yeah, I think this election was almost entirely a referendum on the PPP and the martial law crisis. I mean, there was sort of even for South Korean politics, a noticeable lack of issue discussion in the three presidential debates, that quickly devolved into sort of character accusations of Kim Moon-soo being Yoon's avatar, Lee Jae-myung being, something that's more dangerous than Yoon. And I totally agree with what Tim said. While this is a landslide victory as far as presidential elections go for Lee Jae-myung, what's striking is actually how well Kim Moon-soo did despite everything that he had going against him.
Yeah.
Over 40% of the country still voted for Kim Moon-soo and the PPP, even with the martial law debacle and even with Lee Jun-suk splintering off into the new Reform Party. Lee Jun-suk was in this election knowing full on that he was never going to win it. So I think, this was sort of a foundational moment for Lee Jun-suk. I think as a continuing central figure going forward in the conservative camp. So I think that's something to watch for. And so while the results are a near majority for Lee Jae-myung, they are also pretty far from a categorical repudiation of the PPP. And I think that this is actually a really important point for the Democratic Party to remember as it now steps into power.
If I could just add a quick point
please.
on that. I think if you look at the race constitution, it was, I've been saying Lee Jae-myung is South Korea's most popular politician. He's also the most unpopular politician. So I think the one thing I want to see from Kim Moon-soo and the PPP going forward is how much of this turnout for them was legitimately turnout because they like Kim as a candidate or a personality or even the party, and how much of it is simply anyone but Lee support. And I think that we'll see in the coming weeks and months.
So the next test for the winning candidate, Lee Jae-myung, is to convert this honeymoon period that he has with the National Assembly majority and riding this popularity into office, is to convert some of his campaign objectives into reality here. And he has highlighted a couple of key things, and that's the economy, political unity, a pragmatic foreign policy. Pragmatism seems to be a word that he uses quite a bit. And we've seen him moderate his positions on certain things, including trilateral U.S. Korea Japan relations, something that the Korean media has referred to as right-clicking. So, Tim, you had a really interesting interview with Lee Jae-myung at a pivotal moment late last year. Could you give us a sense for who he is? What's his story, and what's he like to meet and to speak with?
We did talk to him just after the first failed attempt to impeach President Yoon. And, he was actually willing to engage with us on almost a presidential like discussion. We talked about foreign affairs. We talked, about martial law. We talked about the future of the country. I think, President Lee is one of the most talented South Korean politicians I've seen since I've been here since 2017. He's a very effective retail politician. He's has a lot of dexterity. He's not tied to certain positions. I mean, as you mentioned, with the three-way relationship with Japan and U.S., it wasn't that long ago. He said the Fukushima nuclear wastewater dump into the sea would cause a Pacific World War III. He called the three-way naval drills a security disaster, pro-Japan. He certainly moderated that on the campaign trail. But he grew up poor. He, dropped out of school. He worked in a factory as a teen. And I think this is an important point to consider because when you only pay attention to him in the last couple of years, he's clearly has a huge social media following. He's very prominent, powerful. He did not grow up that way. And I think if you're ever in the room with him, you can really sense he's a survivor. He's been through a lot. And, I mean, he has a lot of plot points, but there was an assassination attempt on him last year. He was stabbed in the neck, and he told us that if the knife had gone only 1 millimeter deeper, he would have died. He needed emergency surgery, to save his life. And he told us from that incident, it gave him even more calm, more perspective. He considered the life he has as a bonus. And I think you could sort of see how he decided to run in 2022 as president, and how he did more recently. So he walks into the presidency with a lot of power. He's the president. He's got the legislature. He's going to have an ability to pass his agenda, shape Korea in the way that he wants to. And again, he's got this tremendous rags to riches backstory, survival, political fighter. And, he's entering the arena now, not only with people inside South Korea, but, the world.
Really interesting. Thanks so much, Tim. Aram, over to you. What resonated with voters this time around? He lost by less than a percentage point last time around. So what are some of his strengths and weaknesses, and how do you evaluate his ability to achieve some of the objectives that he set out for himself?
I mean, I think no doubt, like timing mattered tremendously in this election, but also the strategic awareness by Lee to seize the narrative mattered just as much. Lee Jae-myung led the charge, in the scene that Tim opened with, right, of scaling the walls with National Assembly members at gunpoint from the military to vote to repeal martial law. And this was a literal embodiment of the democratic repertoire that's so deeply ingrained in Korea's national psyche that gave the left incredible moral high ground at the same time that Yoon's martial law decree put the conservatives on a moral deficit. So yes, timing mattered, but I think it would be a big mistake to underestimate Lee Jae-myung as just simply being the right person at the right time. He's demonstrated really shrewd political strategy and just incredibly sharp situational awareness. And I think those are, really important assets to have, especially as Korea now sees itself having to walk the tightrope between China's economic pressure and the US's security alliance. The other thing I want to talk about Lee Jae-myung is that this was the highest turnout rate since the 97 presidential election that came out on the heels of the Asian financial crisis and was actually the first partisan turnover for South Korea since democratization. And I think, Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's also the highest winning margin between presidential candidates. But I think it's also important to highlight the contours of that public mandate. So I'm looking at exit poll data. The majority of women in all age groups, except for 60 years old and over, voted predominantly for Lee Jae-myung. Lee Jae-myung was also just overwhelmingly dominant for both gender groups in the 40s to 50s age group. Now, if you think about who these people are, what these groups represent, these are groups that, for different reasons, felt kind of either left behind or excluded from the conservative agenda. And what it means is that Lee Jae-myung's administration needs to deliver on distinctly progressive solutions to the domestic challenges of gender and socioeconomic inequality. And, with a 60-day campaign, the specific plans for how policies will precisely achieve this idea of universal basic rights, right? In 22, universal basic income was a big part of his plan. He dropped
Right.
that. How policies will actually achieve that, it was still quite elusive during the campaign. So it remains to be seen how he's going to do that. I mean, in the first, not even 100 days, in the first 30 days, right off the bat, Lee Jae-myung has some high stakes foreign policy challenges that he needs to figure out in terms of striking the right tariff and trade deal with Trump. But in my mind, it's just as important that he focuses on getting the domestic development right, in a way that's actually inclusive to these groups that became a central part of his support base in this election in order to prevent further destabilization at home.
Excellent. And just to follow up on some points that you opened up. So the turnout for the election was over 79%, according to the National Election Commission, the highest turnout since 1997. And that's 44.39 million eligible voters. Lee received 17.28 million votes, which is the most for any candidate in South Korea's democratic history, 49.42%. But part of that is because of South Korea's shifting demographics, right? The aging population causes that a little bit. So let's get to implications for the U.S. Korea alliance. Tim, we'll start with you. President Lee has identified U.S. Korea relations as the cornerstone of the foreign policy. But there are some challenges that he's going to have to address, including burden sharing and harmonizing the approach to regional security challenges. And you broke a major story recently that it's possible the Pentagon could reconsider some strategic flexibility in terms of moving some U.S. troops off the peninsula. So can you talk to us a little bit about what this election result means and how President Lee is going to have to contend with some of these challenges?
The focus of the Wall Street Journal's coverage of the presidential election in South Korea really focused on U.S. relations. And we zoned in on President Lee's comments that he articulated on the debate stage in his best-selling book. South Korea should not be overly reliant on the U.S. Now, that does not mean he wants to abandon the alliance. In fact, he said he wants to expand it, shift it from a security partnership alliance to something broader, economic partnerships, economic ties included. But I think Lee wants to see a South Korea that has a bit more self-direction, has more agency, gets along with its neighbors in a way that did not quite exist under the Yoon Suk-yeol South Korea. And I think, Lee is keenly aware of how important managing the U.S. relationship, getting a trade deal with Trump, getting on the same page with troops and security, because yes, this didn't actually generate much conversation on the campaign trail or even in foreign media accounts. But yes, North Korea is increasingly belligerent. It declared South Korea its #1 enemy last year and has abandoned hopes of peaceful reunification. That's all in the background. But we have sort of more immediate issues that I think Lee will have to deal with right out of the gates.
Aram, over to you.
I think Lee Jae-myung recognizes the necessity of the U.S. alliance for Korea's security. The real test is going to be how he's going to balance that with China's economic pressure, China being South Korea's #1 trading partner, especially in light of what the U.S. Defense Secretary Hegseth said recently in the Shangri-La dialogues that, explicitly to Alexandre's no more hedging. right? So pragmatism is great in theory, but it's really hard to keep in practice because you risk becoming a unreliable partner, which in high stakes diplomacy is often worse than being a reliable antagonist. I think that we saw this play out with the Moon Jae-in administration with the fumble with China relations and THAAD, for
Yeah,
example.
right.
So I think, two things to look out for. Um, you know, President Trump practices a kind of, for lack of a better term, like a personalistic diplomacy where
Yeah.
he appears to engage first and foremost with the individual leader versus more so the actual country or the regime. And so we see that in his close relations with Russia's Putin, at one point with North Korea's Kim Jong-un, although that has cooled off since. So Lee Jae-myung has, branded himself as Korea's Trump, and I think in terms of his style of leadership, that could actually be an unexpected area of diplomatic edge as he deals with the U.S. The other thing, and this, Tim touched on this, is how Lee Jae-myung will redefine the basis of the U.S. Korea alliance. The regional power balance has shifted significantly since the birth of that alliance, such that the alliance it's not just about security or just about even the bilateral relationship anymore. The U.S. troop base in South Korea is also very clearly a hedge against the China threat. And it also serves as an important chess piece in dealing with Russia's efforts to continue to try to deepen its pocket of influence into the center point of East Asia through its military alliance with North Korea. So I think, can Lee Jae-myung come up with not just, are we pro or anti-U.S. alliance? I think that's too simplistic. It's more, how are we going to redefine the basis of this alliance, and will it be in a way that can advocate for broader Korea's national interests? Is, I think, the thing to be watching.
Excellent points. And one of the ways that cooperation will expand beyond the traditional security realm is through things like supply chain cooperation. And that brings us to the trade and investment relationship between the United States and Korea. So Lee has identified the economy as his number one priority, and Korea faces some pretty steep challenges there, as Tom identified sub 1% growth projection for the year. President Lee hopes to pass a supplementary budget rather quickly to supercharge local consumption. And he's expressed optimism that he's going to be able to strike a deal quickly with President Trump over tariff reduction. So, Tim, let's start with you for your thoughts on how President Lee is going to be able to manage this or not.
Jonathan, maybe just to clarify, President Lee has said he's in no rush to make a deal with the U.S. and Trump on trade. I think, obviously he's just jumping into the situation now, but that's what he said on the campaign trail. I think South Korea, compared to other stages of, when left-leaning leaders were in charge, South Korea actually has a lot that it brings to the table to America. It has a huge military industrial base. It can actually make shells and tanks. It can make ships. Yeah, shipbuilding is a huge one. We've seen some of the big corporate giants of South Korea, Samsung, SK, Hyundai, LG, pour tens of billions of dollars into the U.S. to help revitalize the U.S.'s manufacturing base. Now, unfortunately, a lot of that came under President Biden. And during the Biden administration. So I think there's a sell that needs to be done to update that, make it seem new, make it seem like an accomplishment under President Trump. And one of the biggest drawbacks of the past 6 months is that you would do this in a Trump administration by going leader to leader. But they've not had anyone until just recently, just in the past day. In fact, we ran through 3 different acting presidents during the past 6 months. They weren't able to get Trump on the phone, I think, until late April. So, we had the tariffs proposed on autos and steel and reciprocal tariffs. And this was a key moment not to have someone who could pick up the phone or jump on a plane and go to the White House and say, you know what, South Korea, we are one of the biggest investors, foreign investors in the US. We can help you on shipbuilding to catch up with China. They didn't have that powerful of a leader to make that case to Trump. Now they do.
And Aram, some of these issues around geoeconomic cooperation are reminiscent of that security challenge that you identified earlier in a pragmatic approach where you're trying to balance. Regionally, that's difficult, particularly when you look at industries like semiconductors, where so much of South Korea's production base, there's a lot in the US, there's some in China as well. So how is Korea going to be able to manage this? And you can also discuss domestic economics if you'd like as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the famous words of Bill Clinton, it's the economy stupid. But, I think that whatever path Lee Jae-myung ends up pursuing in terms of trade deals, it needs to be pursued in tandem, right? As I mentioned, in ways that address South Korea's inequalities in gender, the labor market, as well as welfare. On the campaign trail, Lee Jae-myung promised significant investments into AI as a means of kind of helping South Korea's economy regain its self-reliance, to be less dependent on export trade. Which again, I think is a good idea in theory, but how that's actually going to alleviate existing inequalities is unclear. In fact, I think it's an idea of the expansion of new industries, if not done carefully, could actually, especially in the realm of things like AI, could actually exacerbate problems in the labor market by pushing more people out of jobs and the labor force, the very people that actually comprise the central sort of progressive camp, at least by the exit polls. And so, I think he's in a really difficult and tricky situation. But I think too much focus. Obviously, there's so much focus on there because the tariff pause is going to expire, so we have a deadline, right? But I do think that too much focus on the deal with Trump and that taking away the focus from coming up with really distinctly progressive policies on how to alleviate domestic inequality. I think that is just as important for keeping things in check at home. And you need that. You need that cohesion internally within your own country to be able to, bring the country along with you on these trade deals where there's going to be wins and losses. And so I do think that is, as much of a central economic agenda, or should be, in his first month as the trade deal.
Great points, Aram. And Tim, I want to turn to you for any thoughts on the domestic economic side. And here's another aspect where President Lee is trying to strike a very difficult balance between, yes, honoring those labor routes, but not pursuing overburdensome regulation. And that's something that he talked about in his inauguration speech, we want to support industry. We don't want to be overly burdensome there. So how do you look at things, Tim?
Well, it's come up a few times. He's going to inject some emergency funds into the economy right out of the gates. I think if you talk to people who lived in his province, who lived in the city where he was mayor, generally they liked how he ran things. And yes, he did things like offer a form of universal basic income to young people. He also was able to attract mega investments to the province as well. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what moves he makes at what tenor. Because again, there's very little to stop him from the conservatives. It's really DIY almost in terms of what he's going to be able to pass. They don't need this, 2/3 majority to pass a lot of this stuff. So, and I think, the challenges are very grave. I mean, South Korea, young people are underemployed. From almost the time they're in daycare, they're in these cram schools. It's very competitive. Everything's on a knife's edge. And, people are exhausted and, there's just a lot of despair with young people. And how do you create an economy that not only, adds to GDP in this sort of, disattached way, this directly correlates to the birth rate, which
Yeah.
is the world's
Yeah.
lowest. People just don't think they have a future or that they can afford to have a family. And, if you look at a country's report card, that alone is just such a dispiriting and such an indictment on sort of how South Korea is constructed at this moment.
Aram, definitely want to turn to you on demographics because this is something that you have done a lot of interesting work on. So what are your thoughts there on how Korea can turn this trend around to lowest birth rate in the world?
So as I said, the majority of women under 60 voted for Lee Jae-myung. But on the campaign trail, there was very little in terms of gender issues. I think that was something that was learned from the 22 loss in comparison to Yoon's sort of explicit appeal to younger conservative men, right? So that was noticeably sort of downplayed in his campaign. The thing with the demographic and the fertility rate is what's really interesting is that in South Korea's big push for modernization, men were given the role of, sacrifice for the state in terms of security and military service, but also be the one to go out and be in the labor force to build up this export-driven economy. Women were asked for a different kind of sacrifice, which is to be the keepers of tradition in the realm of the home, right? To be the wise mother, to be the wise wife, but to do that in a modern way. So, what we don't talk about enough is that it was an explicit part of South Korea's developmental project to curb the fertility rate, to ingrain a notion of the modern family as a nuclear family, really trying to shift the mindset from post-war survival of having to have as many kids as possible because you didn't know, how many of them would survive, into no more than 2 kids, right? And so, this was an explicit campaign where contraceptives were given out. And, it was, if you look at the posters from this era, it was just a explicit mandate by the state to curb fertility. And women were sort of seen, and women's bodies were seen as the vehicle through which that was going to be accomplished. And so the shift in the state's demands now for women, and also part of that modern mandate was to have fewer children and raise them in a way, as Tim said, in an aggressive culture of meritocracy with a big emphasis on education and modernizing the next generation in a sense. So it's a bit of a stark move by the government to then turn around and say, actually, now we want you to have more babies, without actually placing women back into the driver's seat of re-envisioning their agency and their place, their fundamental place in Korea's globalizing and modernizing nation. That discussion or those policies have not been in place. You can't, you're putting the cart before the horse in terms of the way that the government has dealt with fertility campaigns, and that's why none of them have really been effective. It's not just that women don't want to have children. If you look at the marriage rates, those are falling like almost in parallel with the fertility rates, right?
Interesting.
And so there needs to be much more comprehensive policy of rethinking the role of women in Korea and how women can be not just sacrificial contributors, but actually leaders of that discussion. And I think that's an area and where Lee Jae-myung has the support. And it's a real, I think, window of opportunity to make some good headway in that realm.
Thank you very much, Aram. Now let's turn to inter-Korean relations, an area that is set for some interesting developments. And you could see kind of a constellation with President Trump having a history of direct negotiations with Kim Jong-un and now having a partner in South Korea that is also interested in direct negotiations. President Lee talked about on the campaign trail phased nuclear talks with North Korea, using phrases like peaceful coexistence, cooperation, engagement, also very much discussing deterrence as a backup for if that doesn't work out. So, of course, it takes two to tango, and North Korea has to be willing to come to the table. And given its new backing from Moscow, it remains uncertain whether North Korea is going to be willing to come to the table. So, Aram, let's start with you and discuss a little bit about these inter-Korean relations and where you see them going.
So Lee Jae-myung is a self-branded pragmatist, but really no politician exists entirely outside of his or her party. So I do still expect Lee Jae-myung to pursue the more characteristically progressive agenda with engagement with North Korea. But as you said, North Korea has changed quite dramatically since the last time we had a progressive president in the South. It has officially taken reunification off as a national policy goal and has essentially dubbed South Korea a rogue sovereign nation. And through the military alliance with Russia, it's gained resources and security that it didn't have before. And its trade levels with China, I think, are back now to pre-pandemic levels. So it's building back up slowly but surely its economic resilience after the COVID's devastation. So North Korea today, compared to, even just 5 years ago, neither wants or I think even really needs, at least immediately, to come to the table. So, inter-Korea relations, in my mind, has less to do with what Lee Jae-myung wants or plans. And it has more to do with actually his ability to convince that South Korea has something to bring to the table that Russia or China doesn't have. And I think to me, that's where the US comes in.
Hmm.
If Lee Jae-myung can bring North Korea back into the fold in a way that helps Donald Trump's ambitions of leaving a legacy of being the global peacemaker, and if Lee Jae-myung can then manage to get North Korea something in return from the US that it needs, that Russia and China cannot provide, like alleviating the sanctions, for instance, I think that could actually become a pretty significant bargaining chip in sort of a three-way triangulation between the two Koreas and the United States in a way that might actually open the door for Lee Jae-myung to get something for South Korea in that process in terms of the trade deal. And so I think it's no longer sort of just inter-Korea relations as sort of separate from U.S. Korea alliance. I think it's all related now, and it'll be interesting to see how he finesses that complexity.
That's a great point, that we tend to look at these things in silos, these different topics, even the way that we have this discussion today. Well, inter-Korean relations are over here, trade is over here, U.S.-Korea alliance is over here, but these things are all interconnected. Tim, Wall Street Journal doing so much good reporting about North Korea, and you and your colleagues regularly breaking new and interesting takes on what's going on over there. How do you see things unfolding?
Well, given this huge ambition that President Lee has to be on good terms with everyone, bringing up North Korea, you sort of wonder, how does this three-way relationship with Japan and the U.S., how does that survive any type of reinsertion or resurged interest from Pyongyang? I think this will be an interesting thing to monitor over the next 3 years, 3.5 years specifically, because I think Kim Jong-un is very smart. He knows that he was able to get at least somewhere down the line with President Trump. He knows this is a grand opportunity. I mean, Kim Jong-un is a young guy. He's 41 years old. This might be his best shot at a deal with the U.S. And, taking out the possibility of, Trump having more than 3 years. If we look at sort of just his second term, Kim Jong-un knows this. And that leaves, well, what about South Korea? I think the biggest struggle for Seoul will be, what role do they have in any U.S. North Korea talks? Do they have enough agency and voice to not have a deal come together where their fingerprints aren't on it, or at least their approval? Because the ramifications will certainly be huge on the South if there's any type of denuclearization deal between Kim and Trump.
Yeah. Of course, during the last period of rapprochement, South Korea and Moon Jae-in administration played such an instrumental role, Pyeongchang Peace Olympics, et cetera, segueing into that diplomatic spring season. And then, of course, things took a left turn, and North Korea ended up dramatically demolishing the Inter-Korean Liaison Office in the border area as a symbolic rendering of Korea's intermediary position becoming obsolete. So now the challenge will be for Lee Jae-myung's administration to reclaim that role in a sense. Okay, so I think now what we're going to do is we're going to turn to our audience questions. So we've got so many people tuning in live from all over the world, and this is the opportunity for our audience members to ask their questions directly. So for that, I turn over to my colleague Chelsie to handle that.
All right. Thank you both, Tim and Aram, for the very fascinating discussion during the moderated portion so far. So I'll read out some questions that we've received. Either of you feel free to just jump in and answer. So one of the first questions we have is from Dennis Dyson from DSG. And in light of our conversation about how we're changing the basis of the U.S.-ROK relationship, Dennis asks, do you see South Korea assuming a more active strategic role in the region in light of the U.S. reducing its international commitments? And if so, what new role or kind of new take on its role will South Korea have? So what would that look like? And either of you, feel free to jump in to answer that.
You want to? Okay, sure. I'll be brief, and then perhaps I would love to hear Professor Hu's perspective on this as well. I mean, we got a bit of a glimpse into this, on the campaign trail. President Lee was asked, what should South Korea do during a Taiwan-China contingency? And he said we should keep our distance. So this is not South Korea just living in isolation, and it gets to choose how it wants to operate in the world. There's going to be a China pressure, China charm offensive. You're going to have U.S. They're going to have their own desires and wants with all these levers to pull on South Korea. So, but that's where we're at. That's where we're at starting out of the gates with the Lee administration.
There's been a lot of talk in the foreign policy community about the return of spheres of influence and the return of sort of great power competition. And, what that does actually is that it actually gives some space as the great powers are occupied with themselves for middle powers like Korea to become regional leaders. And I do think that, this was sort of muddied because of the martial law crisis, but I think that Foreign Minister Cho, outgoing Minister of Foreign Affairs, did a fantastic job with the trilateral, with sort of elevating Korea's diplomatic status in terms of, behaving like the big person. In how it deals with Japan, how it deals with the Indo-Pacific, really behaving like a regional leader. And so I think, the thing to watch would be how that continues to unfold. I'm a little bit worried that with a progressive administration in power, what we're going to get is sort of a backtracking of that effort in terms of having more atomized regional relations, right? So as Tim said, Lee Jae-myung very explicitly said, like, there is absolutely no interest in getting involved in cross-strait affairs. So we should expect little in the way of, I think, any kind of democratic alliance on that front. He supports the trilateral, but trilaterals only work when there are also strong bilateral relations between each of the three partners separately. And so far, the foreign ministers, South Korea and Japan, have been able to do that. Each side acting like they are the bigger person in the relationship and proactively doing so with regard to history issues. Again, I think no politician exists completely outside of his party. So while Lee Jae-myung is committed to that relationship, it's unlikely that he won't succumb again if I think something triggers, some kind of event or happening triggers in his progressive camp, sort of the anti-Japanese narrative once more. And how that's going to actually sustain in terms of a trilateral is, I think, unclear. So I think ultimately what we have, at least at face value going in, is a more atomized and less sort of value-based, liberal values-based relations in the region, which is not a good time for that to be happening.
Okay. All right. Thank you both for that. And I think, Aram, near the end there, you started addressing a question we received from Deborah Nam Crane from JCAN MA. And her question was whether Lee Jae-myung, if we'll see Lee Jae-myung move closer to Japan amid escalating tensions between the US and China and North Korea, increased North Korean aggression. And I think you're kind of touching on whether or not anti-Japanese sentiment might play into what we see in the future. But any more thoughts on kind of Japan and Korea's role outside of the trilateral and trying to kind of take a larger role in the relationship?
Just simply, you can't have both North Korea and Japan. As much as you try to hedge that, I think given the historical relationships between North Korea and Japan, and separately with North Korea and South Korea, it's just you can't have both. And so, it'll be interesting to see how that's managed. If I had to guess between those two, that if it came down to rubber meets the road and South Korea had to choose, I think that it would actually choose to try to bring North Korea back into the fold. You know, so much of the polling data show that, majority of South Koreans no longer care about reunification. But there's still a large generation in the older generation that does. Maybe not necessarily cares about reunification, but cares deeply about inter-Korea relations. And so, as I said, I'm a little bit skeptical when push comes to shove, how valiantly the trilateral and relations with Japan will be pursued when North Korea becomes a liability.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you. And so I'm going to turn over to a question from Yoo-jung Kim at American University. This question kind of touches on what we discussed at the start of the conversation, the status of South Korea's democracy. And so Yoo-jung asks, in the past 8 years, Korea has had 2 successful impeachments and snap elections. And so with this in mind, how would both of you evaluate the status of Korea's democracy personally? So to turn it over to either of you.
This is this is her lane, so I'd love to hear her response.
Interestingly, Andrew Yaw at Brookings and I published a piece on this very question before the martial law crisis and any of this unfolded. And we were really there was a lot of talk about democratic backsliding and erosion, and that had ultimately also spread to the gold standard democracies in Asia, including Korea. And our point was that backsliding implies that things were really good and then they got worse. Our point was that the nature of the polarization issues and the democratic quality issues that we're seeing in Korea have always been there from the inception. They're just much more visible now because why? Because the underdog force, which was the South Korean left, took time to become a major player in democratic competition. And now that it has caught up, not only caught up, but just recently beat the conservatives in the snap election, those issues are now really, as I said in the beginning, out in the open, emerge to the surface, all of that. So it's not that, hey, we were doing well and all of a sudden, where's this polarization coming from? It was already there. It just wasn't as visible because during the authoritarian era, the state had a complete monopoly over that kind of narrative contestation. And even in the post-democratization era, the South Korean conservatives were able to maintain their electoral edge and dominance precisely because they were the authoritarian legacy party, right? So these elements have always been there. So I would characterize, we characterize in that piece that South Korea is not so much a case of democratic backsliding as it is a case of kind of hitting a ceiling. So we term this, the idea of a democratic ceiling, that certain democracies, because of the pathway that they took to democratize and the origins of the opposition that pushed that democratization and what were their goals, that depending on those things, sometimes some democracies are born with more of a cap to their quality unless they can solve these long-stemming divided issues that in the case of Korea really stretch back not only back to the Korean War, but even before that, with the division among the elites during Japanese colonialism. So in some sense, that still casts a very long shadow. But whenever this kind of happens where the opposition rises to be a major player, it is also a real opportunity for these long-stemming issues to get resolved in a different way. So I do think that's in that way, South Korean democracy is really standing at a pivotal crossroads in terms of its quality going forward. This can either be a period of real reformation. I'm not talking about constitutional revisions per se, but real reformation in terms of redefining the relationship between the Korean people and the South Korean state. Versus it can be a continuation of, just more of the old. In fact, more of the old in a much more exacerbated way now that the former underdogs are a major player. And so, I'm both nervous and optimistic for South Korea's democracy.
One thing that's different this time around is that a major milestone for a newly democratized country is the first time that the opposition wins the presidency, right? And then in Korea, we saw these rather long 10-year periods where the progressives and then the conservatives would trade off power. And that continued for some time. And now we're seeing these kind of very quick whipsaw reversals from one party to the next. So this tempo, this dramatic change feels quite different than anything that we've thus far experienced in terms of Korea's democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both, Jonathan and Aram. Tim, do you have anything to add there?
Just very briefly, I mean, they're both the major candidates for this race actually talked about should they rethink the presidency? Should there be not just a single 5-year term, but could a president be reelected? And I think that hints at sort of the newness of South Korea's democracy. Like, why did they have a setup where you could only be president once for a 5-year term? That creates a lot of risk for lame duck status. And I think we sort of saw that with President Yoon. He never had control of the legislature.
Yeah.
So that put him, behind the 8 ball. And, maybe enough time has passed where they could consider a longevity of a single leader, which might have been a bit jarring back in the 1980s when they drew up the Constitution.
Yeah, no, really great point. And I guess as we look forward to Lee Jae-myung's presidency, there's a lot left in store for South Korea and its democracy. So I'll end there with the audience questions.
Thanks so much, Chelsie. Thanks to all of our guests for tuning in. We really appreciate you. Thank you so much to Tim and Aram. Marvelous job, our President Tom, for joining us from Busan, South Korea late at night. We hope that you'll join us again. Next week, we're joined by Professor Bruce Bechtel for a discussion of his new book on the strategic partnership between North Korea and Iran. So that's next Wednesday at noon. We hope you'll join us for that. Stay tuned to all the wonderful events that the Korea Society has on offer in diverse fields, including arts and culture, language, it goes on and on, corporate. And we hope you'll consider joining the Korea Society as a member. So please see koreasociety.org for information on that. Come see us in New York. We're at 350 Madison Avenue. Thank you, Chelsie. Really great program. Appreciate our discussion today. I think it provided a lot of insight on a very quickly developing issue that's hard to get a grasp on from this historical, contextual, big picture sense. And Aram and Tim, you gave us just such a wonderful perspective there. So we really appreciate you. Hope everybody has a great day. Come see us again soon.